U.S. Navy's defeat of the Japanese fleet at Midway allowed them to move from defensive actions to the offensive. Intelligence noted Japanese forces building airfields throughout the Solomon Island chain, northeast of Australia. These bases protected the Japanese Army's flank as it continued its advance on New Guinea. When the U.S. Navy received reports of an airfield being constructed on the southernmost island of Guadalcanal, that meant enemy bombers were now not only threatening the vital communication and supply line to Australia, but were in range of American bases further south, at Espiritu Santo and New Caledonia. Hastily made plans for the assault gave Marines just 6 weeks to prepare. Outlying islands saw heavy fighting against Japanese defenders, but the landing on Guadalcanal was unopposed. To counter the American landings at Guadalcanal, the Imperial Japanese Navy sent a task force to attack the American transports. On the night of August 8th through the 9th, 1942, a major sea battle erupted off nearby Savo Island. The Imperial Japanese Navy routed the United States Navy, sinking 4 cruisers and damaging 2 destroyers. The straits north of Guadalcanal where this battle occurred were quickly dubbed Iron Bottom Sound. The U.S. Navy reacted to the threat by pulling its ships out of the area, leaving the Marines unprotected and without all of their supplies. With limited U.S. Navy forces to oppose them, the Japanese sent reinforcements to Guadalcanal almost nightly via the channel running down the parallel chain of islands comprising the Solomons. Marine fighter squadrons arrived at the partially completed airstrip renamed Henderson Field on August 18th, 1942. Daily, they rise aloft to battle Japanese fighters and bombers. Japanese infantry launched a series of savage ground attacks against Marine defensive positions surrounding Henderson Field, acquainting American troops with their suicidal banzai charges. All these attacks were defeated, but at a high cost. The Imperial Japanese Navy continued their efforts to defeat the U.S. Navy and retake Guadalcanal. Several more sea battles were fought in the area, with no way to reinforce or supply the remaining troops. The Japanese army decided to withdraw and concede Guadalcanal to the Americans. By February 7th, 1943, over 10,000 Japanese soldiers had been evacuated. The next day, Guadalcanal was declared secure. At 6 months, it was the Marines' longest ground campaign in World War II. The Allies were now 3,400 miles from Japan, and the Noose was in place. The main objective of the Allies after Guadalcanal was the neutralization of the major Japanese garrison and naval base at Rabaul, on the northern tip of the island of New Britain. Logistically, an invasion of Rabaul was not feasible, so Operation Cartwheel was designed to isolate it and let it wither on the vine. To do so, Japanese airfields on islands further north in the Solomons had to be captured. First among those was New Georgia. In June 1943, U.S. Army troops landed on the islands. Heavy jungle fighting raged for 4 months before the island was declared secure. The next target of Operation Cartwheel was the major island of Bougainville, near the northern end of the Solomon Islands. Japan had begun constructing several airfields there, which hampered Allied air attacks on Rabaul. After capturing several nearby Japanese-held islands, Marines landed on Bougainville's west coast on November 1, 1942, where there were no enemy airfields, but the local terrain was suitable for their construction. After 6 weeks of fighting to expand and protect the beachhead, the first operations from the newly completed airstrips began on December 10, 1942. Medium-range bombers could now attack Rabaul. 3 weeks later, the Marines were pulled out of Bougainville and U.S. Army units continued the fighting. The Marines lost 700 killed, but the Allies were now only 3,000 miles from Japan. After Bougainville, Operation Cartwheel continued seizing smaller Japanese-held islands near Rabaul. The successful U.S. Army campaign in New Guinea meant Rabaul was essentially surrounded by the Allies. Airstrikes from newly commissioned aircraft carriers combined with attacks from ground-based bombers from New Guinea and the conquered Solomon Islands rendered the Japanese base ineffective by the end of 1943. It was impossible for the Imperial Japanese Navy to reinforce, supply, or evacuate Rabaul. Not only were between 75,000 and 100,000 Japanese troops essentially marooned at Rabaul, but aircraft based there no longer posed a threat to American operations in the Central Pacific. The noose around Japan tightened. The success at Guadalcanal and in the Solomon Islands was the first step in the Central Pacific campaign, a Navy operation which used an island-hopping strategy to move from success at Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands through the Gilbert, Marshall, Mariana Islands to Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Along the way, the Truck Supply Center and Palau Island were also handled. But Maudsley reminds us on page 238 that there was a second simultaneous Pacific campaign. The U.S. used a two-pronged attack in the Pacific. In addition to the Central Pacific Offensive, there was a Southwest Pacific Offensive led by the Army's Douglas MacArthur with Navy support. This attack had started in 1942 and moved through New Guinea and the Solomons to the Philippines. The Japanese military used the time after Pearl Harbor to seize and fortify strategic islands that would form a protective wall around Japan's interest in Asia. Their security was based on two assumptions: that any attacking force would use a frontal assault, and that each island would be taken in order. But the U.S. Navy adopted an island-hopping strategy. They chose only less defended islands that would provide a strategic location for air or naval operations. The Navy realized it did not need to take every Japanese island but neutralize the air bases. After the bloody fighting in the Solomons, the Marines had a well-deserved R&R, then moved on to the Gilberts. The most famous action was Tarawa, actually Betio Island on the Tarawa Atoll. In 3 days of very bloody fighting, the U.S. Marines counted 1,000 dead, along with almost all the 5,000 Japanese defenders. Using lessons learned from Tarawa, the Navy made improvements so that the Marshall's campaign was less deadly. They used heavy naval bombardment prior to landing, and carried heavier armament, even tank-piercing shells, although the Japanese had no tanks. The outcome for the Japanese, who had no means of retreat, was still annihilation. Also in February, the U.S. rained massive airstrikes on Truk Island, destroying the key shipping hub and safe harbor of the Japanese Navy. An airfield on the northern Marianas would be in range of Tokyo for bombing for the new B-29 bombers. It would also provide excellent naval facilities. The Marianas were the key. Gilberts had been required to access the Marshall Islands, which themselves were required to secure communications to the Marianas. Japan, too, saw the Marianas as key and committed to a strong naval defense. During the naval battle, the U.S. shot down over 250 aircraft and sunk 3 Japanese carriers. A decisive victory, and the last time Japan was anywhere near equal with naval strength in the United States. In all, it took 3 months to gain control of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. On Saipan, U.S. troops first saw mass suicides of Japanese civilians and soldiers. Following success in the Marianas, U.S. forces took Palau Island in the Palau Group. This island was not strategic in access to Tokyo, but was essential to support the American attack on the Philippines, where the Western and Central Pacific campaigns would converge. It also set the stage for the final 2 island battles, Iwo Jima and Okinawa.